Hey, good morning. Welcome to Redwood Church. We are so glad that you've joined us on this Sunday, September the 10th. So grateful for those who joined us last week. We were, as I said, we had pre-recorded last Sunday, and so we were out of town. We actually took Zach back to school this past weekend, and so it was much different this year. There was not near the anxiety of the unknown. There was a lot more joy. We returned to a familiar place which we've grown to love, that has become a second home for Zach, and reunited with his roommates, all of whom are still together this year. And we just had a great time getting him settled in, and we're very happy with his new room, his new dorm. Weather was beautiful, and so we had a really, really nice visit and got him settled in, and he has had a great first week of school, for which we are extremely grateful. We certainly continue to pray for those who were impacted by Idalia. Fortunately, I think there was very limited loss of life. There was certainly a lot of property damage, a lot of cleanup to be done. And now we got this massive storm brewing in the Atlantic that we hope will just go back out to sea, but could impact the Northeast, could impact near Princeton. So we're keeping an eye on that. This week, in addition to all of that, last week, as we talked about in the sermon last week, was Labor Day weekend, the kind of unofficial beginning of fall. Actual fall will happen here just in a couple of weeks, and we are going to see our first hints of fall-like weather in Atlanta this week, and Zach will experience some fall-like weather later in the week up at Princeton. It has been hotter there than it has been here, and they do not have air conditioning in their dorm. So we had to go pick up an extra fan before we left, but he doesn't complain. He kind of just goes with the flow and makes it work. So I'm looking forward. As you know, anyone who know me for any period of time knows how much I love the fall, how much I love fall weather. Football season is in full swing, and there were some upsets yesterday, and I'll confess that I'm not as excited about football this year, even with our new coach at Georgia Tech. It just so much else going on in the world that it's something that we watched a little bit yesterday, and it was fun, but probably not the priority for me that it once was. But as we sit here today on September 10th, 2023, tomorrow is September 11th, 2023, which means it has been 22 years since the events of September 11th, 2001, a day that those of us who were alive on that day will likely never forget, although our sermon this morning will remind us to not forget, because with each year that passes, I've noticed there is less news about the recognition, the remembering that day, the anniversary of those tragic and terrible and awful events. I know that I should have looked, but I'm assuming they will continue to have the vigil at the site where each of the names will be read. And I've preached on this many times before, and without not recalling everything that I've said prior. I was in my first full-time appointment in Pine Mountain, Georgia. Shannon was working in Atlanta at Marsh, and I was on the phone with her as the first building was smoldering and as the second plane hit the second tower. And we later learned that the Marsh offices in New York City were one of those most dramatically impacted. One of her colleagues died, and we've seen his name on the memorial there. And so it had a very profound meaning for us as a young pastor, as a young husband, and just thinking about all that was going on. And so I want to talk this morning about what it means to remember, why it's important to remember, because tomorrow I'll try to there's a graphic that I've used before, and I'll say it again tomorrow, probably very simply. We must never forget. Every generation, it seems, has those moments that they shouldn't forget. We think about Pearl Harbor Day, and we think about some of those just dramatic events that have impacted the course of individual lives and indeed the course of human lives and humanity as a whole. And I think September 11th, 2001 was one of those days. And so it had tremendous impact on me personally, on on our families and all of our families. And so I'm going to read from the Old Testament today. Now, if you've been with me in any of my previous churches, and if you've heard me preach in our time together as Redwood, you know that I do not often preach from the Old Testament. It's probably one of my many failings as a pastor. I'm much more comfortable in the New Testament, particularly in the Gospels. Part of that is that I believe that I've been called to preach the gospel, the good news, and so I think that as often as possible, that is the primary source for my preaching and teaching and the way I live my life. But the gospel is a part of this overall story of God and God's creation and we as God's people. And so there's so much depth in the Old Testament. There's so much important context and history in the Old Testament that is a part of our history. It's a part of who we are. And it's kind of a double meaning today, that it's important that we remember, that we don't forget the stories of the Old Testament that inform who we are as people of the New Covenant. So we'll talk a little bit about that today as well. And so we're going to be in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, and verses 6 through 10. And this is when Moses is preparing the Israelites to enter into the Promised Land and also preparing them for the fact that he will not join them. So what Moses is trying to do, much like his parents, now this was not as true this year, but last year when we were dropping Zach off at college at 18 years old, we all of a sudden panicked, I think. Did we do what we needed to do to prepare him? And so now you're trying to jam in everything you've done for the past 18 years into 2 or 3 days to prepare him for the coming year. The reality was we had prepared him well. And I wrote about that on my Facebook post last year when we returned home, that there really wasn't a lot of need for anxiety or fretting because we had done the work. And I think Moses had probably done the work with the Israelites, but he probably had that same moment of, I need to make sure that I remind them of all that has been taught to them, all that they have learned, all that they have heard, so that as they enter the Promised Land, they will remember who they are as God's chosen people, so that they can become exactly who God created them to be as God's chosen people. So let's hear these words of Moses to the Israelites in Deuteronomy chapter 4. So now, Israel, give heed to the statutes and ordinances that I am teaching you to observe, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving to you. You must neither add anything to what I command you, nor take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God, with which I am charging you. You must observe them diligently, for this will show your wisdom and discernment to the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people. For what other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is whenever we call to him? And what other great nation has statutes and ordinances as just as this entire law that I am setting before you today? But take care and watch yourselves closely, so as neither to forget the things that you have seen with your eyes, nor let them slip from your mind all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children, how once you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when the Lord said to me, assemble the people for me, and I will let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me as long as they live on earth, and may teach their children to do so also. So Moses is clearly trying, as I said, in this last moment to teach this group of people. Now, what we have to remember is he reflects back to Horeb, it's a long time has passed. And in fact, those who of that one generation have almost all died. And so when he says what you heard at Horeb, what he's really saying is what your ancestors heard when I spoke and I gathered the people as God commanded. And so the first thing I want to think about this morning is what a generation is, what it means to be a generation, and what generations are and how they work and how long they work, or how long they are. And so When you look up, when you Google what is a generation, you get numbers anywhere from kind of 15 to 30 years, that a generation spans anywhere from about 15 to 30 years. So here we are, 22 years removed from the events of September 11th, 2001, which means that there are a lot of people alive today who were not alive on that day. And if you take the people who were just a year or two old, that really have no recollection of it. We're getting into that 25 to 30 year span of a generation. And we think about what can be gained or lost in one generation and how quickly things can change, how quickly we can forget. You think about the generations that we think about in the United States. And you go all the way back to the greatest generation. And then there's the one I've talked about before in sermons, the silent generation that was... They call it that because they were kind of in between the greatest generation and the boomer generation. Then there's my generation, Generation X, and I'm doing a lot of reading and research right now in our generation. Many of us called us the forgotten middle child, the forgotten generation, the next silent generation, that we're kind of jammed in between the boomers and the millennials. And those two groups are so much... They have so much more prominence in culture, and it seems as though marketers and those who study human development and human behavior spend a lot more time on the baby boomers, on the millennials, than they do us. And so there's a lot to be learned there. But if we think about a generation, what we're thinking about it, particularly as it relates to the events of September 11, 2001, is that if we don't continue to remember and not forget and teach our children and grandchildren the lessons of that day, then it could easily be forgotten. It could easily fade into history and just be one more paragraph in a history book. And I think it was far more than that, and I think it deserves far more attention to that. And so what are the lessons that we learned from September 11th, 2001? And Moses will go on to recount the lessons. He says, you remember these ordinances, and what he does in Deuteronomy, and goes back and he teaches them all the things that you should remember. And so the first thing that I'm going to say that is a lesson of September 11th, 2001, and I think maybe we had forgotten this before that day, evil exists in the world. It's not something that people like to talk about. It's probably not politically correct anymore to say that there's evil in the world. It's probably not politically correct to call out people as evil. But there are evil people in the world. There is just no doubt about it. The kind of evil necessary to plan and execute an attack like we witnessed 22 years ago tomorrow is just pure evil. The man who headed that up was pure evil. The men who executed, who carried out those attacks, pure evil. It's something with which we're uncomfortable. We don't really, being rooted in kind of Methodism. We always joked around in Methodist circles that we don't talk about such things in polite Methodist circles. Our Baptist friends love to talk about sin and evil and all of those kind of things, and we kind of tend to rest in the grace and the love and the mercy, and we're really comfortable in those areas. And then Catholics, we joke around. We got the Catholics are good at the guilt and some of those other things. And again, I joke and try to draw a little levity from this, but it's important that we recognize that evil exists. And so when we see that on that grand a scale, what it should teach us is it's not just that evil that exists so far from us, that there's evil that exists in our very backyards. When we think about human trafficking, we think about some of the most disgusting and evil things that are happening in our world today, and so much of it happens just right under our noses, and we're not even aware. Think about the deaths that have occurred from fentanyl, and what kind of evil it takes to first to have drugs to begin with, but then to lace drugs with a substance that they know can kill somebody. I mean, that's just evil. And so that first lesson of September 11th, 2001 is that we were reminded in a very stark way that evil existed. I start there because I want to go, and I've done this the past couple of weeks, so it's reinforcing what we've already said. It also reminded us that there are far more good people in the world than there are evil. It reminded us that there are a lot of really good people. Because as we've been told before, and in one of the many things we do not need to forget about that day, one of the many things we must remember about that day, is that as people were fleeing the Twin Towers, as they were running and driving as hard and fast as they could from downtown Manhattan, from lower Manhattan, firefighters, first responders were driving toward the danger. They were walking into the towers. They were climbing the stairs of a building that was on fire and collapsing. There are good people in this world. There are people who put others before themselves, and they are all around us. And they are just under our noses. And they are far more numerous than any of the evil people who exist in the world. I've shared with you stories in the past few weeks of goodness, good people in this world, and I can continue to see it play out again and again and again. There are just really good people in the world. And when we're reminded that there are good people in the world, we were also reminded, and that's what Moses is telling the Israelites here, is that, hey, you are God's chosen people. You have to remember who you are, and what you need to do is you need to live into the community that God created. As you go into this new promised land, you need to remember God's laws and ordinances and what you have learned, what you have been taught. Because if you will practice those, you will become the community that God created you to be, and the world can get closer to the way God intended it to be. So we're reminded that there's evil in the world, but we're also reminded that there are very good people in the world. And here's the other lesson that we learned, that we have far more in common than what separates us. I did a little reading this week, and there is mixed data on what we all have been led to believe, or at least what we've heard anecdotally. Anecdotally, we were told that following September 11, 2001, there was a rush of people back to church, back to worship, back to their faith. There's been some of the, Pew and other places who have done some studies and have said, our research, our data doesn't really bear that out. But then there were articles in Wall Street Journal and New York Times that talked about statistics that said that, yes, at least for a few months, there was this rush back to faith, back to church, back to worship. I can only tell you my experience, and that was that within a few hours of those events, we were already planning a prayer service in Pine Mountain, Georgia, where I was serving at the time. And that service was packed. And in the weeks and months that followed, our church attendance did increase, was more consistent. Now, Pine Mountain was a wonderful little community where even till this day, church is still such a priority because it's so woven into the fabric of who they are. You get in more urban and suburban areas, and it's easier for other activities to take priority. In fact, when I got to Pine Mountain, I went to the post office on a Wednesday afternoon, and I went and the door was locked. And I was like, why is the door locked, the post office? And if you remember from me telling this in the past, that I went to, when I first got to Pine Mountain, they said, hey, you need to go get your post office box. I said, no, I'll just get my mail delivered to the house, to the Parsons. They said, well, we don't deliver in the city limits. You have to have a post office box. So I had not checked my mail, went to check my mail, the door's locked. They shut down the town on Wednesdays because all the churches had Wednesday night supper and there were Wednesday night activities. And so faith was so woven in the fabric of that community. It just wasn't Sunday, but it was also Wednesday, which had been a traditional time when people of faith gathered in the middle of the week to be reminded of all that they had been taught and learned. So we have far more in common than that separates us. So not only did we return to church that reminded us of where we were coming, but there was, at least it was far too brief of time, but at least for a brief period of time, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, all of these people gathered with one mission, one cause. They were united. There was a sense of unity among our people, and really globally. The people, our allies, and not just our allies, but even some of those with whom we had disagreements, who understood just how evil that was. And so there was this moment in time when there was a sense of unity that we had not experienced probably since the ending of World War II. We're at a time and place where we need to recapture that. And I don't want it to be necessary for a tragic event to bring us back together, because we are at a very divisive time. Now, there's all this hyperbole about it's the most divisive time we've seen in the history of our country, of the world, and people who say that don't understand history. They don't know the reality of the fact that we've had extreme conflict, extreme disagreements, both in our country and in the world. I mean, even in the early stages of our republic, there was great division. People forget we actually fought a civil war and Americans killing Americans. And so rather than having to get back to that point, I think the church needs to be the institution that leads. And the challenge is the church is in decline, and it's in significant decline. So these words of Moses to the Israelites, I think, are Moses' words for us today. So just as he was speaking to them as though they were that generation that had already gone, I think Moses is speaking to us, reminding us that we are God's chosen people, that we are the people it's necessary that we find a sense of unity, that we find a sense of belonging, and that we find all of those things that we hold in common so that we can present a united front to our families and our communities in the world, so that we can recapture who we are. I think the last thing the final that I'll talk about today, there were a lot of lessons. The final one I'll talk about today: in bad times and good, God is always by our side. For what other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord God whenever we call to him? God is always near. I found this commentary by a gentleman named Steve Davidson. He had served in high-ranking roles at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. And he's writing on this text from today, and particularly about verse 9, which I read for you as a part of this reading, which was really probably the most important verse of what we read, and in what we read, which is the line that said, "But take care and watch yourselves closely, so as to neither forget these things that your eyes have seen, nor let them slip from your mind all the days of your life." And he writes this to kind of wrap all this up. The routine of obedience is not a good in and of itself. The routine of obedience works to promote the community, a just community. Through obedience, those who follow God's statutes and ordinances enact the vision of righteous community, conspicuously different in all the ways that the world needs today to ensure full thriving for all. Conspicuously different. God calls us to be conspicuously different. That is the way we change the world. For too many years, the church has sought to embrace culture until we were not different from culture, until we couldn't realize that we had become a part of culture. I think we're called to be conspicuously different. And I'll leave us today with this from Moses' final song to the Israelites in Deuteronomy 32, verse 7. "Remember the days of old. Consider the years long past. Ask your father, and he will inform you, your elders, and they will tell you." Will you pray with me? Almighty God, as we stand on the eve of a day that was so tragic, that was so difficult for so many of us to watch, may we never forget what we saw with our eyes. Those of us who were alive and witnessed those events, may we never forget. May we not only not forget, but may we teach our children and our children's children. But as we do, as we share the story of that tragic day, and we remind our children and children's children of evil. May we quickly get to the point where we tell them of all the good people, of how we rallied together, how we found common ground, how we acknowledged God's presence, and how we became conspicuously different in a way that changed the world. God bless us this day and throughout the rest of this week, for we offer ourselves in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I hope that you will stay connected throughout the week on social media at RedwoodATL, at our website at redwoodchurchatl.org. If you would like to contribute to the mission and ministry of Redwood Church, you can do so by going to redwoodchurchatl.org/give, or you can text Redwood Church to the number on your screen. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your Sunday and a great week. God bless. Take care.